On holiday.
Good morning again, and welcome for those who have just joined us on this session. This session wants to give you and discuss an overview of the role of the United Nations and the role of the different UN agencies in implementing the guiding principles. Guiding principles has been a collaborative effort between various UN agencies. Implementation will also require coordination and probably capacity building in many of the UN agencies. So we will hear first from Lynn Wendland, who is advisor on business and human rights in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She will present the latest Secretary General report on business and human rights. And then we'll hear from other colleagues in the UN system, from Ursula Winhoven, who is the General Counsel in the UN Global Compact Office in New York, from Aja Hietavuo. She is the CSR specialist of UNICEF. And after that, we will listen to respondents from the business sector, Sir Mark Moody-Stewart, who is the chairman of the Foundation for the Global Compact and the co-chair of the Human Rights Working Group of the Global Compact, and Mrs. Heba Mostafa from the Permanent Mission of Egypt in the UN, who has followed very closely and participated in the development of the guiding principles. And we will also hear from a member of the UN Human Rights Working Group, Business and Human Rights Working Group, Alexandra Guaqueta. So let me start with Lynn.
Thank you, Pierre, and thank you to everyone for coming to the session. So the role of the United Nations system in the business and human rights agenda was recognized by the Human Rights Council in the resolution that endorsed the UN Guiding Principles and that created the UN Working Group to support the dissemination and implementation of the Guiding Principles. So the Council recognized that it's important to have a special procedures mechanism like the UN Working Group, but this agenda really needs to sit within, also be anchored within the United Nations system itself, and that as we are looking to actors like states and business and civil society, national human rights institutions and others to promote and advance the business and human rights agenda, we shouldn't leave out the role of the United Nations, and in fact the Council then asked the Secretary General to prepare a report on what role the United Nations system as a whole, so not just OHCHR, not just the UN special procedure mechanisms, but the system as a whole, including funds and programs, could play in advancing the business and human rights agenda, particularly the guiding principles. So this report by the Secretary General was submitted to the Human Rights Council in September this year. And it was developed following a consultative process. So there had been consultations with a range of UN agencies and programs, both asking them to provide information first about what they are already doing when it relates to business and human rights, but also importantly, how would they see the role, how do they see the role that they can or should play when it comes to advancing the guiding principles. So in the end, the report had an activities update, so basically sort of laying out what is already happening, but looking, I think, maybe more interestingly to the future and more strategically placing this agenda on how one can place the business and human rights agenda more strategically within the UN system. The report identified three levels, three issue areas that the UN should integrate. So the first element is the Secretary General asks that the business and human rights agenda, and particularly the guiding principles, be embedded into all internal coordination mechanisms within the UN. And I assume that many of you who are here will know about some of these mechanisms, will be familiar with the UN system. But there is the Chief Executive Board, which is the heads of all UN agencies, the High-Level Committee on Programs, the United Nations Development Group, the High-Level Committee on Management, and some of these very senior coordination bodies that set UN policy, that set policies for what UN agencies are doing, and the Secretary General calls for the guiding principles to be embedded into the discussions and activities of these coordination mechanisms where appropriate. Obviously, we're not going to turn the Chief Executive Board now into a forum on business and human rights, but as they are discussing and as they are considering issues, to the extent that there is a business dimension, a business and human rights dimension, appropriate reference and recognition and integration of the guiding principles should take place. So this was the embedding, sort of strategic embedding in the coordination bodies. The other part of the report is making recommendations specifically to different agencies, funds, and programs. So asking them to integrate in their activities. So there's embedding and there's integration into activities. This whole agenda and particularly the guiding principles. The report identifies OHCHR as playing a central role in this regard, but obviously not the only one. If this is going to have the sufficient level of uptake and actually be able to change behavior, it needs to be integrated into activities of a whole array of UN agencies, including those that are most operational and most active at the country level. Specifically, and I won't go through, I'll refer you all to read the report. It's report 2121 from the 21st session of the Council. But just a short listing briefly, the particular, in addition to OHCHR, the report makes reference to UNDP, to the Global Compact, to ILO, to UNEP Finance Initiative, and to other specific agencies that are relevant, and ask them to integrate these considerations in their activities. From that, the report also identifies that there is a risk of fragmentation when everyone is sort of doing activities, and that's both a huge potential benefit, but also a potential risk. And the report identifies OHCHR as an institutional focal point on guidance and clarification in collaboration with the UN Working Group when it comes to providing substantive interpretation around the guiding principles. The report also focuses on, makes very explicit recommendations to the role of the resident coordinator system at the country level, the role of UNDP, and in very strong terms asks the resident coordinators to ensure that as they have their, the UN country teams has activities at the country level, due regard should be paid to the guiding principles. The report points to the potential role of UN regional commissions, and also make reference to the World Bank Group and others in the development area, UNCTAD when it comes to trade and investment, peace building and security, humanitarian agencies, and others. I have limited time, so I'm not going to go through the details of all the nature of the recommendations, but I do think that the report identifies some of the key strategic entry points and some of the most relevant actors. As per the resolution that asked for this report, the mandate for the report has a particular chapter and a particular emphasis on the issue of capacity building. This was an issue that you will have heard John Ruggie in the opening session expressing particular concern about, and indeed other actors as well during the course of the last day and a half. So looking at the issue of capacity building in the context of the UN system, the report identifies both a huge lack of capacity within the UN system itself. So it's all very well to say that the UN should now be promoting and advancing this agenda, but in fact across the organization, I think we should recognize that there is not a lot of capacity, not a lot of knowledge or understanding, or even necessarily support for this agenda within the UN system. So that's an internal capacity building challenge. But then also the report identifies that potentially the role of the UN as a capacity builder externally is very important. But again, if we don't even have internal capacity, it's going to be difficult for us to build capacity of the actors, external actors we are all engaging with in our different capacities. So that is really a bit of a conundrum, but it's certainly highlighted and identified as a main challenge. And the Secretary General, as a way of trying to come up with, I guess, a way out of this conundrum, he asks that, the report asks for a feasibility study on the possibility of establishing a global fund to support capacity building efforts of all actors. So business, civil society, government agencies or government officials at different levels, and perhaps also capacity of the UN system itself or within the UN system itself. So that process will be taking place during the course of 2013. Where there will be a consultative process that will try to dig into whether that is indeed feasible to have an idea like that. I mean, we've seen in the last decade, in response to some other global challenges that have been identified that are not unique or to the unique problem of any one particular social actor. For example, in the area of HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, we saw the establishment of the Global Fund. Also the Gavi Alliance when it comes to vaccinations, to really try and get participation and ownership of all relevant social actors to help contribute to tackling this challenge. And so we will be exploring whether there is support, whether there would be funding. I mean, this would then be a fund that could attract funding beyond perhaps just traditional government donors. What would the governance structure look like of such a fund? So there are a number of issues, and it's by no means a foregone conclusion that it'll take place. There are a number of issues that would need to be explored, but that is one of the recommendations that were included in the report and indeed reflected by the Council in its response to the report. I think I've probably already taken up more time, so I haven't even gotten to what the challenges and opportunities are, but I think I've already covered some of them. I think that one of the main challenges, this is essentially a report that talks about how can we mainstream business and human rights within the UN system, and as OHCHR having had, I think, 15 or 20 years of experience in trying to mainstream just the broader human rights agenda within the UN system, I think we are under no illusions that the kind of challenges that have been met in or faced in the context of the broader mainstream agenda will not still be there when it comes to business and human rights. So I think that while a number of our colleagues, and some of them are here today, are indeed very supportive of this agenda, I think that the kind of institutional concerns or lack of maybe appreciation for what the human rights agenda adds to the UN's work, and I'm saying that frankly, will also be present when it comes to mainstreaming this agenda. And then capacity building I've already met. I think in terms of opportunities, I think it's, for me, but I'm probably biased, I think it is so obvious what this agenda would bring to the UN's work, particularly at the country level. I think having an informed and intelligent engagement around a normative framework that the guiding principles provides is a huge opportunity for UN actors. How to engage effectively and intelligently with business as part of our, whether we are in development or whether we're in humanitarian action or any other issue that the UN is active in. I think how we engage and appropriate engagement and involvement with business could make a huge contribution to our work. And I think that the Guiding Principles provides a platform, not just frankly in the area of human rights, but the kind of processes in the area of environment, anti-corruption, a number of the other issues where the Guiding Principles could equally be applicable, as indeed has been the case in the OECD guidelines, for example, that has the due diligence process requirement across issue areas that are not human rights. So I think I will leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lynn. Let us move to Ursula from the UN Global Compact. The UN Global Compact was at the forefront of business and UN and business and human rights within the UN system. So Ursula, I'll give you the floor now.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Since this is a UN session, it would be good to actually start with what the UN Global Compact's mandate actually is, because not everyone who's here may know it. Our mandate from the UN General Assembly, which was refreshed in December of last year, is to advance UN values and responsible business practices within the UN system and among the global business community. And in a nutshell, what we do is we advocate that business do no harm, make a difference, and work with others. And if we count the UN Global Compact's for labour principles as human rights, which we think we should, 6 of the 10 Global Compact principles derive from international conventions and declarations, and also recognised by the UN General Assembly, concern human rights. That's 6 out of 10. Corporate respect and support for human rights is the UN Global Compact's first principle. And a note co-published with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is available upstairs at this conference, explains the complementarity of the guiding principles and the UN Global Compact. The note's key message is that the corporate responsibility to respect human rights in the Global Compact is the same corporate responsibility to respect human rights found in the guiding principles. In line with the UN General Assembly and UN Secretary General's recognition of the positive role that business can play to help drive sustainable development, and I should say can play and is playing, the UN Global Compact reinforces this minimum requirement while also going beyond the guiding principles in encouraging business to explore opportunities to take additional voluntary actions where the core business, strategic social investment and philanthropy, public policy engagement and advocacy or partnership and other forms of collective action to also contribute to social development. So this is additional voluntary actions that go beyond the minimum, which of course is avoid harm, respect human rights. So this support for human rights is as a voluntary complement and not as a substitute for the requirement of business to respect human rights. And that applies to all businesses, whether or not they're a participant in the Global Compact. To date, there are over 7,000 Global Compact participants from business and a further 2,000 or more from civil society and other actors, which bring the number to 10,000 signatories of the Global Compact. And these hail from 140 countries. And these signatories have explicitly acknowledged their responsibility to respect human rights, the second pillar of the guiding principles, and also committed to support human rights in the way I mentioned earlier, and to report progress to their own stakeholders on at least an annual basis using the framework which is called the Communication on Progress. And organisations that don't do that will be made non-communicating and ultimately are excluded from the initiative if they don't do it. So I mentioned that we have over 7,000 business participants today, but Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and nor us is satisfied with that. So he's actually set the task of 20,000 participants by 2020. Since the UN Global Compact began over 12 years ago, the Global Compact Office has worked very closely with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and other partners on the business and human rights agenda. Together, we've developed and promoted tools and guidance materials ranging from a human rights management framework, an online training with certificate, guidance on how to develop a human rights policy, how to conduct human rights impact assessment, and how to report on respect and support for human rights. And we've also actively promoted tools and guidance developed by other organisations. We try not to have a not invented here perspective. We have had a multi-stakeholder human rights working group under the auspices of the Global Compact Board for many years, and we're the secretariat for it together with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we're very pleased to have both the co-chairs of this working group on this panel, Mr. Sané and Sir Mark. Since the guiding principles were endorsed by the Human Rights Council, the working group has made promoting the guiding principles and their implementation one of its top priorities. So beyond tools and guidance, which I've already mentioned, the Human Rights Working Group of the Global Compact focuses on good practice development and dissemination through good practice notes, peer-reviewed case studies, an online dilemmas forum developed with an organisation called Maplecroft. And the working group also periodically engages in collective action and has prioritised support for local networks and special initiatives that flesh out the corporate responsibility to respect and commitment to support human rights. And in that context, we're thrilled that we have so many representatives of Global Compact local networks around the world together with us, not only in this session, but in the conference overall. And immediately prior to this session, we had a session on the Women's Empowerment Principles, which is one of these special initiatives that the Global Compact Human Rights Working Group contributes to. So these special initiatives, they entail working very closely with other UN agencies, including UN Women and UNICEF, that we'll hear from in a moment, on what the UN Global Compact and corporate sustainability means as regards specific stakeholder groups, and on the ways that their UN mandates can be advanced by working more systematically with the private sector to engage the private sector on corporate responsibility and sustainability in both that respect and support context. The outputs to which the members of the Human Rights Working Group have also contributed have included the Women's Empowerment Principles and the Children's Rights and Business Principles, and we've also been working over the last 9 months or so with the UN's Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues on a draft business guide to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which will actually be launched in exposure draft format on Monday for multi-month consultation. And similarly, we're actually working at the moment on an exploratory phase for work on the rights of persons with disabilities and business. And we see all of this work going to what business and human rights may mean from the perspective of particular stakeholder groups and how business interacts with them as important fleshing out of the inclusive dimension. The Global Compact's overarching goal is more sustainable and inclusive global markets. So on the inclusive side, we've been delving much more deeply into the issue of women's empowerment, children, Indigenous people's rights, and the rights of people with disabilities. Also, more generally, we work across the UN system through the UN Private Sector Focal Points Network, which I think has around 200 UN professionals at the moment, as well as business.un.org, to promote responsible business practices, including on human rights, particularly in a partnership type context and other forms of collaborative arrangements between the UN and the private sector, which have been growing kind of exponentially in recent years and are likely to continue that trajectory. So a key opportunity that we see and that we've been pursuing actively is an integrated approach to human rights that recognises respect for human rights as an essential dimension of corporate sustainability. This enables us to promote human rights in corporate sustainability and sustainable development contexts, and we very much see the post-2015 process for what's to succeed the Millennium Development Goals as a very important opportunity for business and human rights. And in this context, we're delighted to have recently been given the official role of providing the business contribution to the Secretary General for this process, and we'll be reaching out to gather input for this. So there are some challenges though. Some challenges are the need for more practical material in languages other than English, to go beyond the usual suspects and effectively engage new business audiences around the globe, including smaller businesses. And UN Global Compact local networks in 101 countries are one key to addressing such challenges. And there was a session yesterday that delved into this a little bit more detail. And we're thrilled that a number of local networks have established their own country-level human rights working groups and are working on tools to help companies in their countries know how to know and show respect for human rights. And we heard in the session yesterday about the importance of a safe space for businesses and other actors, including civil society and trade unions, to be able to have dialogue to advance business and human rights. So we very much encourage the companies and other organizations who are present at this conference to support and engage in these local networks around the world to help bolster local capacity and to bring your expertise to these. And as one example, there's an excellent tool by the German network, which was mentioned yesterday, which is actually available. They have a booth here upstairs, and it's really worthwhile checking out their wonderful practical tool. So we've been doing a lot to promote respect and support for human rights over the last 12 years, inside and outside the UN. If we had more capacity, we could certainly do more. And to get very specific for a moment, we would like to add another technical expert to our human rights team to help us with integration in case there are any governments or other organizations out there that would be interested to support that. So that's a very specific call on increased capacity. And so just finally, in summary, what we're calling for really is combining compliance with innovation and shared value creation, more technical resources, simple messages to help reach new audiences and better support small and medium enterprises, more local engagement and collaboration, including in the context of Global Compact local networks, translations, and exploring opportunities for further integration in the corporate sustainability and sustainable development agendas. And we'd certainly be happy if anyone's interested to share our submission to the Secretary General's report, if anyone is interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ursula. We'll now move to UNICEF. And the representative of UNICEF is Aja Yetavuo. She is the Corporate Social Responsibility Specialist.
Oh, thank you. Very nicely pronounced my name. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the UNICEF Corporate Social Responsibility Unit and to be able to share some of the work we've done externally and internally in context of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and more specifically on children. So when the UN Guiding Principles were being drafted, UNICEF was also engaged in the process, and it became quite soon obvious that the specific guidance in terms of groups like children would not make it into the framework as such. Only a mentioning of the vulnerable groups. So this was one key reason, in addition to the fact that there were many companies actually asking and requesting for guidance in context of children's rights and how to incorporate that into their businesses, that an initiative was started, which was really very much based on the UN Guiding Principles, but specifically looking at how children should be incorporated into this framework. This initiative was led by UNICEF, UN Global Compact, and Save the Children, and it was a multi-stakeholder process which took about a year. And what was really going on was there were, obviously, the civil society was involved, but more importantly, the businesses were very actively involved, and so were institutional investors and other stakeholders. And as a derivation from this consultation process, a tool which is called the Children's Rights and Business Principles were released in March of this year. It's a framework which is built on existing conventions, globally accepted and approved conventions. So it is the ILO core labor standards, it is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and it is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In addition to the global release of the principles, these principles have now been released or being released in 26 countries, and there's more to come. So it's not just a general guidance framework, but it is really being rolled out in the countries, both in the developed and developing world. The principles consist of 10 principles. There's Principle 1, which basically is derived directly from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and it asks for companies to commit to children's rights, but more importantly, it describes the implementation framework based on the due diligence processes introduced by John Ruggie. And the other 9 principles, they set guidance and well, guidance really, for the workplace, marketplace, and community. So if we look at the principle 1, I think what is really, really important about the principles is that it really fits directly into the UN Guiding Principles framework. So it specifically gives a children's lens into human rights, and the specific issues and vulnerabilities that children have are embedded in there. The principle 1 calls for commitment for children's rights, but it also introduces the due diligence process and calls for policy and remedy revision based on the impact assessment and the actions taken from the impact assessment. The difference between the children's rights principles and the UN Guiding Principles is really that this goes slightly beyond the framework that the human rights framework consists of, which is very compliance-driven and focuses on respect. The children's principles, they also call for companies to support children's rights, which is basically go beyond the compliance and also take actively part in supporting and advancing children's rights. So when the principles were launched, there was a lot of interest and support from the business community for this framework. But what became obvious, and I think it applies for the UN Guiding Principles as well, is that any kind of guidance put together by the UN tends to be fairly challenging to interpret by the businesses. So what UNICEF decided to do, working together with both companies and external stakeholders, is to actually turn the principles into some practical tools on how to implement children's rights in the business context. And obvious starting point was the due diligence process, and this is basically what we've done now. And we're happy to say that we now have a set of tools for businesses to actually in context of the bigger human rights framework, and while implementing the UN Guiding Principles, they can look into the specific issues related to the children. So the tools that are actually here now, even present, we have a little stand somewhere here. They relate to the due diligence process. So we started off with the impact assessment. So we have a checklist which has been put together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights. We wanted to ensure that it can be directly used within the bigger human rights impact assessment framework. So that's available now. In addition to that, we have a workbook which basically advises the companies on how to integrate the actions derived from the impact assessment in the workplace, marketplace, and community and environment areas. And we have guidance also on how to monitor progress and how to report against the principles. We started working with the GRI framework and have been actively participating in the G4 development as well. Unfortunately, children's rights so far have not made it into the framework, but hopefully next year there's going to be a working group looking into that. So we started off by doing some research on children's rights within the framework of human rights, and so we have a working paper describing what the status currently is, and a tool which actually uses the existing GRI framework, not only in the human rights areas, but also for society, labor rights, product responsibility, and how you can actually report in that area. There are some other tools coming up. We're working on a policy tool, also obviously looking at the bigger human rights area, as well as how to specifically engage with children as stakeholders. There's also a general comment being prepared for the Convention on the Rights of the Child on business specifically. So for that area, we're working on guidance for company, not only for companies, but of course for governments, and specifically looking at the remedies. And we put together a website where you will find lots of information about this. And these tools that were just introduced, we're starting a pilot now with around 50 companies on actually using these tools, and we've already have some experience of companies who've been doing some impact assessments on human rights and more specifically on children. And in addition to direct engagement with companies, we've created now our first platform where companies we're sort of building capacity on the UN Guiding Principles as well as our principles. We're in Sweden with 20 multinationals, mostly from the OMX 30 group. And there's lots of other initiatives underway. So this just briefly on what we've been doing externally in promoting the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights, and more specifically the principles for the children. And we've done a lot of capacity building with companies. And more obviously, internally, there's been lots of demand for capacity building and work as well. Even though that we've traditionally engaged already a lot in context of human rights and children's rights, having these frameworks and tools now available, it makes a big difference for UNICEF. And we're looking into having a very integrated approach in all our engagement with companies. And internally, we've now done trainings of around 400 people, specifically on UN Guiding Principles as well as our children's rights principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me move now to the respondent. The first one from a business perspective, Sir Mark Moody-Stuart, Chairman of the Foundation for the Global Compact, and then from a government perspective, Ms. Heba Mustafa from the Permanent Mission of Egypt.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak as a business person, trying to give you a view of that business has of facing this complex organization of the UN with its alphabet soup of institutions. And I will only concentrate on the big ones which business would recognize. Business would basically not recognize most of them. They would have no idea what they did. And I'll speak as someone who has been involved in the United Nations Global Compact since its inception. As Ursula said, the Compact now has over 7,000 signatories, initially who sign up to 10 principles which cover environment, human rights, working conditions, and anti-corruption. If you look at and most importantly, I think, while initially the Global Compact was funded when it was founded in 2000 by a donation from a trust fund of member states, mainly European governments, it is now predominantly funded, way predominantly funded by business itself through voluntary contributions made by signatories to the UN Global Compact Foundation, which is what I chair, which goes to support the work of the thing and of the Global Compact. And business wouldn't do that if those signatories didn't think it was worth supporting, because nobody compels them to pay, and they get very little credit for doing it. They get a thank you message and a logo on the website, maybe. If you look at it's very important that the Compact actually looks at embedding these principles in the day-to-day work of businesses. This is not philanthropy. It's how we improve our own operations. And that, if you look at the history of the Global Compact and its interaction with the UN over 10 years, initially the focus was very much on environment and working conditions. That's mainstream business stuff, and we understand that as business people. We may not get it right, but we understand it, and we understand the impact on our business. Subsequently, the anti-corruption principle was introduced, and we understand that, and we struggle with it, and that's a major issue. The one that we had most difficulty with, I think most businesses had difficulty with, was human rights, because many of the businesses would say the very phrase doesn't penetrate very easily into business. But we have made considerable progress with that in the last 4 or 5 years, and we have now a very strong working group in the Global Compact, strongly supported by companies, a lot of companies, of course, in the extractive industries, in manufacturing industries, in developing countries, and so on. So to many businesses, the UN Global Compact would be its first interaction with the United Nations. Now, how and those the next interaction? Well, no. Let me reverse a bit. Probably the most important activity of the Global Compact is through and will be through its local networks. The Global Compact is a multi-stakeholder organization. At global level, these 7,000 plus companies employing somewhere over 50 million people sounds a very large number, but of course on a global scale it is very small. And the bulk of employment is in small and medium-sized businesses. And anyway, action does not take place in New York and Geneva. It actually happens in each and every country. And that's why the local networks are important, because it is only through the local networks that we can engage the bulk of employees, national companies who don't have the time or the money to attend some meeting in New York or some global meeting. And therefore, the local networks are absolutely fundamental. So, relations with other UN agencies. Clearly, the Office of the High Commissioner is fundamental, and we work, as Lena knows, in the Human Rights Working Group very closely on the specific human rights areas with the Office of the High Commission, with whom rest the authority and the expertise. So that's quite straightforward. United Nations Development Programme is also extremely important because the local networks, and Lena made a mention to this, the UNDP, the importance of the UNDP resident coordinators. And UNDP, in many of our local networks, is a very important supporter. And if you look at a local network and the role of business, whether it's in countries which are just opening up to business, if you look at the development role of business, the economic development role of business, hopefully done by responsible business, that coincides and is very much parallel to the UNDP role, which engages governments and donor agencies and so on. So I think, again, that interaction is quite clear. And then lastly, I would come to specialist organizations like UNICEF, and I think we've heard very clearly how the UN Global Compact, working with a specialist organization on a particular area of importance, and working, as was just demonstrated, very much in the area, and that's how the Global Compact works, very much in the area of developing practical guidelines, exchanging experience, having meetings where people can talk about real life problems and issues, on whether on a global but preferably on a national level. What are the national priorities? Can you bring people together under the umbrella of a UN Global Compact local network in a kind of safe space where people, big business, small business, local government, local civil society, international civil society, international business can actually get together and work. And I hope you can see that's how a business person would see relationship of one of our businesses with the UN system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Mark.